Good morning, everyone. It's 10:40 a.m. in the U.S. Eastern Time Zone. I'm Professor Jim O'Rourke, and from the University of Notre Dame, this is 10 Years Hence. Welcome. Our speaker today is Jamie Fly. He is President and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Jamie previously served as President and Chief Executive Officer of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Prague in the Czech Republic from 2019 to 2020. He most recently was a senior fellow and senior advisor to the president, working out of the Berlin, Germany office of the German Marshall Fund, where he researched and spoke about transatlantic relations, U.S. foreign policy, great power competition with Russia and China, as well as democracy and human rights. Jamie served as counselor for foreign and national security affairs to Senator Marco Rubio from 2013 to 2017, serving as his foreign policy advisor during his presidential campaign. Prior to joining Senator Rubio's staff in February of 2013, he served as the executive director of the Foreign Policy Initiative from its founding in 2009. Prior to that, Mr. Fly served in the Bush administration, at the National Security Council, and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He received a BA in International Studies and Political Science from American University in Washington and an MA in German and European Studies from Georgetown University. So live from Berlin, Germany, Jamie Fly, welcome to 10 Years Hence.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be with you and with everyone watching today. I'm going to talk a bit about a theme that I came up with for this session called Making America Competitive Again in the Information Space.
All right. Let me just say to our viewers, wherever they may be, at the foot of your toolbar, there is a Q&A tool. If you have a question for Mr. Fly, by all means, put that in there. My research assistant will curate and gather those together, and we'll take up your questions toward the end of the hour. And Jamie, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So I want to talk about information in the modern age, why it's important, not just for all of our ability to learn about what's happening around us, but also why it's important to our national security, how authoritarian governments are trying to exploit the current information environment that we all live in the modern age. And then talk a little bit about my current work at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and how the United States government engages in the information space in a variety of ways. And in the case of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, through support for US international broadcasting, and some of the challenges that a news organization like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has in this modern age. And then maybe conclude with some thoughts about other efforts beyond US international broadcasting that we might need to think about in the US context to deal with a lot of the information vulnerabilities, which I'll describe. And then I look forward to the questions and the conversation. Just first on why information is so important. I think we all in the modern age with readily available access to cell phones, to the internet, we've really come to take information for granted because it's constantly at our fingertips about a wide range of topics, to almost any topic imaginable. News is pushed to our phones or to our computers on an instantaneous basis. We don't really have to work hard to seek out information. Quite frankly, the bigger challenge that we have, and not just Americans, but as I'll describe later, basically people across the world, even in developing countries, the bigger challenge is parsing that information and trying to figure out what is truly important information that you need to pay attention to, and which information is trustworthy, which is a huge challenge, which I don't think most people even think about. So we take information for granted. Despite the fact that we take information for granted, I think we need to recognize the essential role that information plays in our democracy, in a vibrant, functioning democracy. Democracy is fundamentally based on the free flow of information, the free flow of information to citizens so they can make informed decisions about who to vote for, what policies that they should support and advocate for and ask their elected representatives to support. Information that citizens can then use to judge the conduct of their governments and whether their governments are truly seeking their best interests and broader society's best interests. So information plays a key role in just the basic functioning of democracy. Related to that, and also critical to the functioning of democracy, is a free press. And our founding fathers spoke and wrote about this. Thomas Jefferson wrote that our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited, referring to limiting the freedom of the press, without our liberty being lost, which I think is an important reminder, again, given some of the challenges that the independent media face in this modern age, which I'll describe in a minute. So all of these are reasons why authoritarians, especially in recent years, and when I say authoritarians, I'm talking about non-democratic regimes around the world, seek to control information. They certainly seek to control information within their own societies, whether it's the Chinese government, the Russian government, the North Korean regime, the Iranian government. Control of information is central to their own stability and their own success. They subjugate independent media. They often have state-sponsored propaganda outlets to try to impress their narrative upon their publics. But increasingly in recent years, we've seen those same governments which have mastered control of information and control of the press for their own internal purposes. They've begun to realize that democracies, because of their reliance on independent news and information, are increasingly vulnerable in the modern age because they can take efforts to undermine citizens' confidence in their democratically elected governments. They can use the openness of our democratic process and our democratic debates to use information to try to shape narratives within democracies. And so ultimately, the information space, so to speak, has become a new domain where competition is playing out on a daily basis, not just between the US and whatever democratically elected government you're living under, but also these foreign actors who are trying to use that space to both fight to retain their own power, but also to shape external perceptions of them and also to drive and sow dissent within democratic societies. So the information domain is now a key domain when it comes to foreign policy, international affairs. And I think we've seen that in recent years with some of the events. I'll talk a little bit more about the 2016 election, the increased focus on foreign interference in democracy. So this is a domain which is now getting much more attention. It's not just in the United States and Europe where we see these vulnerabilities and these challenges in the information space. It's across all of the world, even as I said, developing countries. RFERL, the organization which I lead, serves 23 countries and 27 languages right now across Eurasia. And as I travel and engage in the markets where we provide news and information, it's been striking for me to look at the work of our individual language services putting out news and information in local languages. And to do that, we do a lot of analysis and research about those markets. We look at consumer trends, where citizens are going to get news and information. And in survey after survey, whether it's an EU member state like Hungary, or a country like Ukraine, which is still struggling to consolidate its democracy, to a developing country like Afghanistan, where we also operate. The trends are all in the same direction, some faster or slower than others, but the trend is away from traditional outlets, away from radio, away from print, even in most of those markets, away from television as sources of news and information. And all of those markets, people are increasingly getting their news and information online. That's a common theme that we've seen in country after country, and year after year, those trends tend to accelerate. Like I said, in some countries, that process is more advanced than others, and I think the U.S. is clearly probably on the leading edge of that trend. There was a Pew survey just several months ago in January that found that 8 in 10 U.S. adults, 86%, say that they get their news from a smartphone, computer, or tablet often or sometimes, which is obviously a significant amount and a significant change from just a few years ago, where people would have relied on a variety of other sources on a regular basis. And that leads to the question I raised earlier about how do people know when they're getting the information online, many through social media platforms, not just traditional news organizations that have websites. How do people discern whether that news or that information should be trusted? 50 years ago, or even more recently, that was a simple question because there were only a limited number of channels through which people got their news. It might have been a printed newspaper, which they had delivered to their home on a regular basis. In many cases, that was a local newspaper produced in their own hometown or city. They could get it through TV, but a very different sort of TV medium, which was often just 1 or 2 hours of news on a daily basis in the evening, maybe in the morning. They would rely on direct conversations with people that they trusted, either in the professional setting or in a private setting, friends, family, actually engaging with them about a piece of information rather than just kind of passively receiving it. And that whole process, that ecosystem of how people received news and information has obviously now been completely upended because of the transformation to people moving online to have those sorts of exchanges and to get news and information. That's obviously had a significant positive impact and a leveling impact in many senses. Where I talked about at the beginning about any individual's ability to access information about almost any topic at any moment. That's a powerful tool. It can be used in many positive ways to promote social or political change. But that process, that leveling, also has significant downsides. One has been in the destruction of local media, which we've seen not just in the United States, but also in most advanced Western democracies. Local media have often been consolidated, bought up by regional or national conglomerates over time because of the loss of advertising revenue, because of the shift of advertising online to sites like Craigslist and Facebook. There's really been no business model for sustainable local media in many markets. And so you've had entire local newspapers wiped out, just stopped completely. And so local journalism has really suffered. And again, that's something that certainly has happened in the United States. We've seen it in member states of the European Union. And we've also seen it in the markets where Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty operates, that the same trend, just driven by the collapse of that business model. The other challenge, another challenge that we've seen relates to the bubbles in which we've all started to live and to operate online. A lot of this has been driven by the design of the social media platforms. The major platforms that people use on a daily basis all operate based on algorithms which determine what people see when they open up their news feed, when they view a particular channel. And users traditionally have had limited control over determining what shows up in their news feed. Some of it is tied to who they may be friends with on that network, who their broader network is that they've connected to via that platform. But a lot of the determination of what content shows up is actually driven by the incentives of that particular company to promote content either for business purposes or to amplify content which is already going viral, which already seems to be attracting a response from people. And again, that mechanism within most of the platforms can be a very positive thing. It can also lead to campaigns that could be used for good for certain social or political purposes. But those campaigns and that amplification of viral content can also have significant downsides. And there has been study after study that has shown that on all the major social media platforms, that tendency of the algorithm to promote content which is drawing a response can lead to the promotion of hate speech, of racist content that provokes violence, and all kinds of other extremist activity. So there has been a beginning of some conversation about how to work with the companies to adjust algorithms, but again, there's not as much understanding as there needs to be amongst the users of those platforms about how they receive news and information, why particular content shows up on their news feed, and ultimately the credibility issue of where this information is coming from, what the source of that information is, and what the agenda of that original poster of the content is. The other effect of the platforms, given that they are, many of them, built around that social model of you seeing content that was either posted or liked or favorited by someone that you theoretically know in the real world, it adds a certain a veneer of trust to that content. Even if it may be a friend that you haven't seen in decades, maybe if it's someone that you only met once or twice, yet you were friends with them on a social media platform. The fact that someone in your circle is promoting content, liking content, it has the net effect of making you feel a little bit more comfortable about taking that content seriously, even if that content has never been vetted, was originally false, was a conspiracy theory that's being promoted. And so there are some inherent dangers just in the way that we view content, especially on social media platforms. Here, where I'm sitting now in Germany, there was actually a survey that was just released earlier this week by a think tank called Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, which does a lot of interesting work in the online space related to disinformation. And they surveyed a group of German users of social media about how they interact with news and information they receive online. And they found repeatedly, as people were surveyed about how they looked at particular pieces of content, that differences between disinformation, information, advertising, and opinion were incredibly difficult for their survey respondents to recognize as they received that information online. Also concerning from this survey was the fact that as all of these other sources of information have become available, people have started to have less and less trust in traditional news outlets. And this survey found that here in Germany, people doubted journalism's independence from politics. The traditional trust that people had in journalists and journalistic news organizations has eroded over time. And again, that's a trend we've seen in many countries. And so this think tank concluded, which is a conclusion I certainly agree with, that there was a significant need amongst the German public for much greater information about media literacy, about how to interact with content online, and how to parse that content and to understand the origins of individual pieces of content. So given this landscape that we're dealing with, which has shifted rapidly in recent years and is constantly changing, as you all probably know better than I, that people are constantly moving from one social media platform to another, depending on various demographics and age groups, which makes it even more difficult to come up with solutions to tackle this challenge. Given all of this, foreign actors have noticed that this is a fantastic way to try to influence our democratic processes and ultimately our societal coherence. This is not entirely new, it's worth noting. This was certainly a tool that the Soviet Union used against the United States and even within parts of Europe during the Cold War. But if you just step back and think about what that process looked like for someone who was working for the KGB in the 1960s or 70s in the United States or here in Germany, compared to now, I think it's pretty revealing about why this is a more significant challenge at this point. Back in the height of the Cold War, if you were a Soviet agent and you wanted to try to sow dissent in American society, to plant some narratives about either the American role in the world or about supposed injustices in American society, you would most likely have to be physically present on American soil. You would then either have to be operating out of an embassy, taking great risk about possibly being caught as a fake diplomat. Maybe you would be operating under some other cover as a journalist or some other cultural attaché at an NGO sponsored by the Soviet government. But there were limited ability for people to operate in those settings. So first you had the physical access issue. Even if you could obtain access to the relevant country, you had the question of, well, how do you actually, if you're a foreigner, start to be able to make connections to influence political discussion in a foreign country? And the way you need to do that is through people-to-people interaction. You need to engage people in informal settings, maybe meet people at a cocktail party, try to sometimes engage people directly through meetings, but it's not something that can be done very easily. And there are a lot of potential moments during that process where you can be exposed and you could have your cover blown and you could be kicked out of the country, or perhaps, depending on how you were there, even put behind bars. So it's a risky approach. Even if you can make it through that phase of developing a network of Americans who maybe you feel could help advance your narrative in that society, for them to be effective, unless you're recruiting a high-level politician or someone who already has their own network inside the United States, you most likely need some money. You need to maybe help provide them with monetary resources so they can set up an NGO or an advocacy group that campaigns on a particular topic, whether it's nuclear disarmament or whether it's race relations in America. You need to put a lot of work and a lot of resources into that process. And then once you, even if you make it through all those steps, even if you have a perfect person, an American citizen or several American citizens who you think share an aspect of your worldview and can advance a narrative, and you have the money to fund their effort, whatever they do in the advocacy space, given the way American democracy works and how vibrant democracy is with so many different viewpoints, so much debate, even if that group starts putting out messages, starts putting out newsletters, starts trying to reach an audience, there's a very limited audience most of those groups can reach in the America of 1960s or 1970s. They don't have access to the sorts of social media platforms we do now, where they can broadcast a message to the entire world with the click of a mouse or the press of a button. So that, again, is just an example of what the former approach was. Now, fast forward to the last several years, and this has been an ongoing challenge for a number of years now, but I'll just use 2016 as an example in the run-up to the American presidential election, because we have a lot of evidence that's now been revealed through all the investigations that followed that election. We've got the work of the Mueller led investigation by the special counsel. We have bipartisan investigations that have been done, including one by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which documented their findings. You can go online and read the full report, which is hundreds of pages. But we've seen how those tools have been modernized and evolved by, in this case, a hostile actor, the Russian Federation. And what were those tools looking like in 2016? Here are just a few examples, not by no means covering the full spectrum. One was hack and release operations. We saw this with the attempts to get into the email accounts, some successful, of leading members of the Clinton campaign, which they often, I should just note, it wasn't just the Clinton campaign was targeted. They also targeted a full range of politicians from both the left and the right, but the ones that resonated the most related to documents that were stolen from and emails that were stolen from the Clinton campaign. Not just doing the sort of traditional intelligence work, which always is looking at various actors in American society, trying to get inside information that maybe then could be used to develop strategy. So not just surveilling, but also grabbing the information, taking it, and then weaponizing that information. So turning around and planting that information, sometimes with real journalists, sharing the information anonymously with real journalists, so they'll write stories about it, but also using fake websites, which appear to be independent journalists, putting out information that was leaked, all intended to have a political impact, either in changing people's perceptions of the candidate in question, or trying to just drive a certain narrative in the media as the election unfolded. We saw, and we still see, both from the Russians and from increasingly from other actors, another tool, which is amplification of fringe content in democratic societies. This is an incredibly powerful tool because obviously democracies are diverse. People have a wide range of views, which we should celebrate and embrace. And we protect, obviously, through protected free speech in the United States. So Americans have the right to say anything they want, and that's protected. And that should continue to be protected. But what we've seen foreign actors do, especially using social media, is it's increasingly possible to amplify content that in the normal debate should be protected and allowed, but to increase the number of people who are seeing that fringe political content. So the actual number of Americans who may believe or advocate a certain fringe position is actually quite small. But through manipulation of algorithms on social media platforms, through promoting that fringe content on a wide array of online sites, which sometimes masquerade as indigenous US sites, you can actually push more of that content into the mainstream in a very sophisticated manner. And we've seen these tactics certainly used by the Russians in recent years as the US debates a lot of hot button political issues. We've seen that some of those narratives that have been amplified from the fringe, chosen in part because they're divisive internal narratives that exist in American society. And again, that's not entirely new. That was part of the KGB's bag of tricks going back to the 1960s and 1970s, trying to find the issues where it's very easy even for a foreign actor to know that Americans really have disagreements about some fundamental issues, and to trying to really exacerbate those divisions, amplify those divisions. We also see fringe views related to America's role in the world amplified, certainly by the Russian actors. We've also seen other authoritarian actors kind of use these sorts of tactics too in recent elections. Why should this matter? I mean, some people may just say, well, these are protected, at least where they originate, protected American perspectives. Yes, not everyone agrees with them. Yes, some people find them offensive. Why ultimately does it matter? Well, one example of why it matters also was revealed after the investigations into 2016. It wasn't just that we made people angrier in chat rooms or they were really negative in their comments on a Facebook feed, and it led to a lot of fake controversy on an online platform. What the Russians smartly did is they realized that if they got people fired up enough online, they could actually get them to take physical actions, to physical manifestations of those views, and they could actually draw people out and cause them to do things in public to advance those views. In one case, even, in some cases, that was just related to supporting a particular candidate and to doing certain things to organize around that candidate, which again, those Americans had every right to do, but they were actually kind of choreographed as they did it by foreign actors sitting thousands of miles away, never even having to come onto American soil, never even having to spend a cent. In some cases, not always, some cases they had to spend money for ads and promotion online, but in many cases spending next to nothing. Some cases it was supporting political activity, but in other more disturbing cases, especially when it related to some issues related to religion and race, the Russians actually dabbled in getting disparate groups, opposing groups to show up in the same place at the same time with potential catastrophic consequences. In the one case that's been well documented, and there may have been others that we still don't know about at this point, they actually set up fake groups, one appearing to be an organizing group for American Muslims, another appearing to be an organizing group for proud gun owners, and they set up a confrontation outside a mosque in Texas on the same day at the same time, and they organized rallies for both groups at that exact same time. And people showed up. There were actually local news reports after the fact that highlighted, it looked from the video, there was probably at least a couple hundred people in total. Luckily, local law enforcement somehow found out about these competing gatherings at the same day, same time, and they literally kept the two sides apart. But obviously the proud gun owners group was there carrying weapons in many cases, and it was a very tense situation according to the report. So that's just one example which has been revealed after the investigation of 2016 about the sorts of efforts that were taken to sow division and pit Americans literally one against the other. Beyond 2016 and those physical actions, the online efforts, which are mostly low cost, mostly done remotely, we've seen them continue to evolve, certainly in the case of the Russians, their tactics over time. After all of the public discussion and the investigations, they adapted in the run-up to 2020. There was a good report actually just released, I believe, last week, a declassified report from the intelligence community highlighting how some of their approaches changed in the run-up to 2020, but a lot of it stayed the same. A lot of the attempts were still there to influence the democratic process. And the concerning thing is that we've now seen, probably because of the perceived external success of some of these tactics, we've seen other actors join this process. We've seen in the US context, China and Iran, this has been documented by the US intelligence community and congressional investigations, carry out low-level, but in some ways similar efforts to influence American debates. We've also seen a proliferation of this tactic to small much smaller actors, other governments that maybe may have targeted campaigns of influence where they're trying to achieve something in the American political context, advance a particular interest in Washington. We've seen some examples of them kind of looking at these tactics and adopting them as one of their tools of foreign policy. We've also seen in different parts of the world a privatization of these approaches. We've seen companies adopt some of these tactics against opponents or competitors. We've also, working at a news organization, I think we've seen individuals with an agenda, sometimes private, sometimes governments, use these sorts of online efforts, troll farms, to harass journalists and to silence free speech and freedom of the press. There's really been a proliferation of this type of activity in recent years, well beyond just the Russian tactics I talked about from 2016. Some of this goes well beyond a political agenda. Some of it has just this ability for people to exploit the algorithms, to use social media in this way, has just been used by people who want to promote conspiracy theories. Sometimes for no particular reason other than to throw a crazy conspiracy theory out there. Sometimes, again, with a commercial reason. But we've seen this again and again, not just related to political issues, but certainly over the last year, we've seen it related to the pandemic, with a disturbing increase in the number of people doubting whether COVID even exists, questioning the safety of vaccines, information that can actually, if taken seriously, have a horrible impact on people's health and on their own lives. But some of that content go viral on certain platforms, especially YouTube. So what are, stepping back from this kind of horrible landscape I'm describing, what are the implications of that for the United States, for democracies in general that want to protect democracy and defend democracy? And how should democracies respond to these trends and begin to, again, restore a semblance of truth to our conversation, certainly when we're talking about authoritarian regimes compared to democracies. So I want to talk a bit about what the role that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty plays in that space. But before I get into that, maybe a little bit of just history about Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and about US international broadcasting. The United States was a pioneer in the space of doing international public broadcasting and media, going back even to the period, the end of the Second World War and the early years of the Cold War. Institutions were established by the US government, first the Voice of America, which was meant to partially tell America's story to the world, to explain what America's policies meant for the rest of the world. And Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was part of those early years, celebrating its 70th anniversary, actually, starting last year. So it dates back to the early Cold War period. These broadcasters operate somewhat differently than what you may think of when you think of state-funded broadcasting, because today, a lot of the authoritarian regimes that I was talking about earlier, Russia, China, Iran, they all have state-funded broadcasting too. Many of them were kind of actually modeled on the US approach, in the sense that these countries felt that they needed to do more to share their information about their societies, but also their vision for global politics with the world. The fundamental difference, which is essential to understand, is that the US broadcasters, although they did have a mission somewhat tied to US foreign policy objectives in terms of where they operated and the broad themes that they focused on, the US broadcasters have always prided themselves on their editorial independence from the United States government. Despite the fact that their funding comes from the US Congress, they, like other international public broadcasters, if you're familiar with the BBC or Germany's Deutsche Welle, or the French broadcaster France Media Monde, or Canadian broadcasting, or Australian broadcasting, have always had a tradition of editorial independence and doing basically protected journalism on the international stage, basically an international version of PBS in the US for the domestic audience, or NPR, National Public Radio. Their editorial independence has always been central to their mission. Throughout the Cold War, when it comes to RFERL and its work, both broadcasting via radio to the occupied countries of Eastern Europe, to the Soviet Union, through what then was called Radio Liberty, they were incredibly successful. These were media organizations that had significant reach in these countries, which was truly amazing at this time, because those organizations had to operate from afar. In the case of RFERL, the headquarters was actually here in Germany, in Munich. Its journalists, many of them who had just left and fled the repressive regimes to the east, could not go back in many cases to their home countries. They weren't able to parachute in and do a quick report live on the radio about what was going on. They had to rely on informal networks of information. People would pass them information from inside, avid listeners who would share tips, and they would have to then report back from afar to their fellow citizens about what was happening. There were extensive efforts to pressure those radios and to prevent them from accessing their audience. In almost every country, those radio broadcasts were jammed by the host, by the governments, devoting in some cases significant amounts of money to those jamming efforts to block the radio signals from actually reaching people. But the audience still, despite the jamming, despite the efforts to criminalize any engagement with these radio networks, the audience still came to them and still saw them as honest, reliable outlets that would tell the truth. That was the brand, that these outlets would tell us the truth. They were not hiding facts. They were providing real information about what was going on, not just in the world, but in people's own societies. And so they really attracted significant, loyal listeners. To this day, when I travel to a lot of the countries where some of them we still broadcast in, I still meet officials, people who are now getting up in years, but who remember huddling around the sole radio in their family's household with their family members, turning the dial to try to find the one frequency that had not been jammed, during which they could listen to one of their favorite programs on Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty in their local language. It's a very powerful memory for many of those people to this day. And that bond, even decades later, is still strong in the way that they view the type of journalism that RFERL was doing at the time, and the trust that they placed in that journalism. In some of the markets they operated, they had often more than 50% market share, which is almost unimaginable today, especially for a private outfit that was not sponsored by the government in question in the country where they're operating. And so they could become very easily agents of change in those societies, and they did. And the success of 1989 and the collapse of communism across Europe, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union, were by historians to this day, by some of the actors themselves at the time, is largely seen as RFERL is seen as having played a role in those events. Václav Havel, the Czech dissident, later Czech president, was an avid listener and proponent of the radios and spoke about the power in the Velvet Revolution in then Czechoslovakia. Lech Walesa, the Polish social activist who later became President Poland, said, "Would there be Earth without the sun?" when he was asked about the role of RFE's Polish service. And even in the Soviet Union, late Soviet leaders like Gorbachev started to warm up to the work of Radio Liberty. President Boris Yeltsin, who preceded President Putin, actually said that he had lost his mistrust in radio liberty, which was seen as an enemy for most of the Cold War. And he began doing interviews in the early 90s with Radio Liberty, and eventually invited Radio Liberty to set up a bureau in Moscow, which exists to this day, although maybe for the questions is under a lot of pressure right now from the Putin regime. So they were incredibly successful tools, not just of a soft power, but certainly in the case of RFERL, with its promotion of the truth and promotion of independent journalism, of just spreading objective news and information to audiences that desperately wanted it. So what is the challenge today for RFERL in this space, which is now vastly different, as I described at the top, where people certainly are not sitting around once or twice a day listening to one or two radio programs, or even watching one or two TV programs. It's a challenging information domain, even if you set aside those technological changes, certainly across Eurasia, where RFERL continues to operate. Eurasia has been described by Freedom House as one of the worst performing regions in its Freedom of the World assessment. Even in many of the democracies across Eurasia, even including in parts of the European Union, democratic norms and institutions are being challenged by the forces of populism. This was the case prior to the pandemic. I can say, having watched the early months of the pandemic at RFERL and now being back at RFERL in the last month and a half, a lot of populists are using the pandemic to reassert controls over society and advance their interests. Authoritarians are certainly using the pandemic to put pressure on civil society and on independent journalists. And there's a real danger that even as we begin to see the end of the pandemic, that a lot of these controls on the free flow of information will continue. RFERL has basically stayed true to its mission, even decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. It still provides objective news and information. It did go through a period in the 1990s where there was a lot of debate, actually, in Washington by Congress about whether this should still be a tool that the United States funds, whether it still was even needed. But as I just described, unfortunately, we haven't been able to reap all the benefits of those events more than 30 years ago. And so, to be honest, with the landscape, the media landscape looking the way it is, I think RFERL may be needed more than at any point previously in the last 30 years. RFERL's relationship with the US government has changed a bit in recent years. There's been a lot of debate in Washington about how to oversee the work of US international broadcasting, how much US international broadcasting should be tied to the advancement of US foreign policy objectives. And I'm happy to engage in any questions that people have about that. But the independence, the editorial independence of RFERL and its sister networks, which broadcast to other parts of the world, have remained firm and have continued to be essential parts of the brand loyalty that we try to develop with our audiences. In our case, we believe that we're successful and can be impactful because our journalists, for the most part, are forward deployed. Our headquarters is now in Prague in the Czech Republic, which is really a legacy of that relationship with Václav Havel that I mentioned earlier, the Czech dissident and eventual president. He was such a fan and a believer in the mission of the radios that in the early 90s, when there was this existential debate about their future in Washington, he offered to the US Congress to have the radios move to Prague, and that's where our headquarters has been since 1995. But we have a network of bureaus, around 20 across Eurasia, and that's where most of our journalism gets done, side by side by locals, side by side with the citizens to whom they're reporting for, And so they have the pulse of what's going on in those societies, about local politics, about local issues that their audience cares about. That is a challenge in and of itself because of often the security risks that our people have to take on. Sometimes just because of the security situation in that country, like in Afghanistan, which I mentioned earlier, where we've actually lost several of our journalists in the last 3 to 4 years. Most recently, one in a targeted assassination in November. In places like Belarus, which you've probably followed, there's been a lot of political unrest over the last 8 months, where governments can strip our journalists of their accreditation, of their ability to actually be registered journalists, to actually go out on the street and cover events like protests without getting arrested themselves. That's always a challenge. And we've seen targeted harassment campaigns against our journalists, especially those operating out in the field. Sometimes it's a security service of a government that doesn't like the fact that we're independent. It doesn't like the fact that we're doing investigative reporting into corruption or government malfeasance. Security service harassing that journalist's family, calling the journalist in and basically threatening them and saying that if they continue to do their independent reporting, that their family may not have a future, that they might not be able to have a job anymore. And then sometimes it's more indirect harassment. An increasing trend we've seen, as I mentioned briefly earlier, is online troll farms being used either by government actors or private actors who don't like the sort of reporting we're doing to try to name and shame journalists, revealing personal information, slandering them online, all in an effort to cause them to either do a different type of journalism and compromise their objectivity, or just to get out of the business entirely. Two other challenges that we're dealing with is obviously just the digital transformation I talked about earlier. As you can tell from the name and the history, as I mentioned, we were predominantly radio up until the last decade. We still do a significant amount of radio broadcasts in certain parts of the world where radio can reach an audience, like in Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. But the company has been going first through a TV transformation and now through a digital transformation, as most of our audience is moving online. And that has a lot of benefits for us in some respects. The sort of transmission towers that we used to need, the access to that technical capability is much reduced. There's a leveling effect when it comes to online journalism and ability to just use certain platforms. But there are perils in that too, because actually as a broadcaster and a news organization, you lose access to a lot of control. And now you really need to worry about the algorithms. You need to worry about the company decisions. If a Facebook or a YouTube or whatever the local variant is of that particular social media platform, for their own reasons, makes a change in how the algorithm works or how they promote or whether they promote certain types of content, half of your audience can disappear overnight. And so those are the sorts of challenges that we are facing, just like many other news organizations around the world. But in our case, we have to worry about what those platforms are and what that audience landscape looks like across 23 countries all at once, which has its own challenges. And then the final challenge I'll mention is then the role that foreign actors are also playing in this space, sometimes competing directly against us in the same markets. As I mentioned, governments like China, Iran, Russia all have their own state-funded outlets. They are not editorially independent. They do not adhere to the highest standards of journalism. And so they often come into those markets and offer a very different type of product, sometimes which can be appealing in its own way, especially given the way the social media platforms operate and the online structure. It can be tabloid style, it can be clickbait to a certain extent, but it can still draw in an audience. And so, engaging the audience, competing for the audience's attention, which any news organization has to do, can be incredibly difficult when you're up against a variety of actors, both other government-funded actors, but then also state propaganda outlets in the particular country that we're talking about. So how are we responding to all of these challenges? We are really focused on our presence by being there. That's essential. Our credibility is through being on the ground as much as possible, being as local as possible. We've discovered that because of the market forces which have driven local media bankrupt in many cases or just forced them to close, people have this hunger, even in the modern social media age, they have a hunger for information that is directly relevant to their lives. They don't want to, they sometimes want to obviously hear about political information and what's going on in the capital of the country they live in, but there's also a hunger for broader societal issues, issues like access to education, healthcare, environmental issues. These are common themes across our coverage area. And so we're trying to be there on the ground, near them, attuned to their needs as much as possible. We're also adapting, as I said, to the digital environment. We're investing more resources in our digital output. We recently hired a head of digital strategy, and we have several services now that are digital only, entirely digital. So in many cases, we're getting rid of the other platforms if we find that they have a shrinking audience. And so we're adapting in that way. And a final area where we've placed a lot of emphasis is looking at new and innovative ways to respond to some of these problems that we've seen with online media, especially when it comes to the spread of conspiracy theories and information which just is not true. And so we have a line of work that we focused on countering disinformation. Sometimes it's fact checking, sometimes it's coming up with ways through multimedia products to educate people in an entertaining way about basic information that they can find useful in their day-to-day lives, and that will really counter these broader trends that we've seen where fake information, false information can often go viral. And so we're very focused on that. Bottom line is that we've found that for us, given our brand, given our history, that fundamentally the truth still matters. The truth was our selling point during the Cold War. It's what drew our audience to us. And we found that, again, despite the fact that people are being bombarded from all different sources, all different types of information, when they realize that information is being compiled and put together by people in an objective manner, and if it's reliable, that will have them coming back to us time and time again. So that's been our experience with this new landscape. I'll conclude by just briefly highlighting beyond the work of U.S. international broadcasting, which I do believe is incredibly important in pushing back against this disinformation saturated environment that we're seeing in many parts of the globe. What are some other ways that the United States or other countries can look at to help counter the spread of disinformation, help deal with some of these disturbing trends we're seeing in our societies? Beyond government-funded media, I think it's important to recognize that we need independent media. This is certainly the case in the United States, where, yes, it's great that we have public broadcasting, but it cannot be public broadcasting alone. Americans deserve, and citizens of democracies deserve, a wide variety of sources to get news and information. And so we need to find ways, if it's not government funded, through consortia, to develop funding models, sustainable funding models for independent media outlets, including local media. And there have been some positive steps in recent years, some sponsored by the big tech companies to maybe devote some of their profits to this cause, but much more needs to be done. Overseas, it's incredibly important that in addition to supporting their own broadcasting, like the US government does, that the US, through its foreign assistance programs, supports local independent media. In some countries, it's almost impossible for truly local independent media to operate. But in many of these countries, there are often brave individual journalists who have a blog, they have a small investigative project looking at corruption in their societies, they need more support. They don't often have the financial means themselves. They don't have an ecosystem internally that can support the funding of that sort of NGO, but they need external support. And the great thing that I've enjoyed as being president of RFERL is, given that we're publicly funded, where I don't have to worry about turning a profit, I don't have to go into a market and worry about knocking my competitors out of business. It's quite the opposite. We want more competitors in all of the markets we're operating. That's why we're there. We want to be the foot in the door that helps pry open the information space to other outlets, which are truly independent media. And we actually, in some cases, play a supporting role. I've been told by small independent outlets in some of our countries when I visited with them that because RFERL has a particular language service, has journalists that operate in that country, and we do bold investigative work, bold reporting, that those little outlets then can often amplify our work. They can report a few of the sensitive topics that we've unearthed. And whereas if they were to do that themselves before we reported it, they would probably be shut down. But because we are there able to do that work, to highlight those uncomfortable topics, they can at least, for their own audience, follow us a bit down that path without putting themselves at an existential risk. Beyond support for media, the US government and democratic governments generally, I think, need to take the information space more seriously as a vulnerability. We've seen some significant progress on this in the United States since the 2016 experience, which I described, partly through the airing of the investigations, through some legislative debates about changes inside the US government to make the US government better organized, to see these sorts of attacks on American democracy before they happen. There's been more information sharing between the private sector, between the tech companies and the US government. And there's been more information that's been shared between the United States and its allies, including in places like here in Europe, given the vulnerability that democracies everywhere face from this. But more can continue to be done on that front. There also needs to be some deterrent actions taken to show foreign actors that if they're willing to take this step of targeting democracy, that there'll be repercussions, because up until now, for the most part, it's been seen as a low-cost, low-risk tool that can be used to manipulate certainly American democracy, but also the democratic debates in some European societies. The private sector needs to play an increased role. I mentioned some of the information sharing between the tech companies and the US government, but ultimately the companies themselves, I think, need to look inwards more, both to see malign activity that's happening on their platforms, but also to perhaps not be always solely focused just on profit, which gets back to the algorithm conversation, but to maybe think a bit more about what's in the best interests of their users, and ideally to give their users more ability to influence how they interact with content, what type of content they see on their platforms. And ultimately, that leads back to everyone in this discussion, to each and every citizen in democracy, because ultimately more responsibility needs to be taken by citizens to demand more of their governments in this area, to demand more of the companies which they, individual citizens, are using on a daily or hourly or minute-by-minute basis, and to demand change. And that's one area where, despite all that we've learned in the last several years, I still don't think there's been enough discussion about what users truly want and expect from the platforms on which they're revealing so much about their own interests, their own situations. I think there's a lot more that can be done for individual citizens to take more responsibility
We do a few
and to demand
questions,
change.
Jamie, if you feel you'd like to sort of shift gears.
No, that is my final comments. So I'll
Okay.
open it up.
Sounds good. Let me begin by asking maybe this kind of a lightning round set of questions, scope and scale. Um, I'd like to know how big Radio Free Europe is, and I'd like to know if it is joined at the hip or really separate in some ways from Radio Liberty. Can you talk about how many employees, how many locations, how many programs?
Yeah, we currently, the two are one organization. Radio for Europe and Radio Liberty are now merged. For several decades in the early part of the Cold War, they were actually two entities, and Radio Free Europe broadcast to the occupied countries in Eastern Europe. Radio Liberty broadcast to the Soviet Union, and they were eventually merged into one. And so now they're one entity. We have several thousand employees, about 1,600 or so formal employees, another several thousand freelancers who report for us, and 23 countries and 27 languages currently.
No doubt someone trying to ask me to refinance my mortgage. It's the terror of having a landline. Um, let me just ask from a business perspective how the brand is working for you. RFERL is a little awkward. Why haven't you gone to a more compressed labeling or branding for yourself?
That's a good question, and it's a question we debate at length inside the company. It's a mouthful when you say RFERL, Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty. It confuses a lot of people, especially people who are of a certain age and don't remember firsthand the Cold War history. And it's a debate I'm sure will continue in the company, and at some point we may need to change the name. I think currently the assessment has been that because the brand remains so powerful in many of the countries in which we operate, we would actually lose more by changing the brand. The other thing I'll note is we do actually operate through individual brands in each market with slightly different names. They usually all relate back in their local languages to usually Radio Liberty or Radio Freedom. For instance,
Okay.
I talked to the Hungarian team today, and they're our newest service, and their name is Szabad Europa. Radio Svoboda is our Russian brand. And we have started a few new brands which aren't actually tied to the radio theme. We have our Russian 24/7 TV network, which is called Current Time, which goes out under the Current Time brand and is completely operated by us, but I assume for many of its avid audience in Russia, they may not even know that it's actually produced by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So we have begun to experiment a little bit with brands.
Okay. Well, a couple of questions. Let me read one from one of our viewers. This viewer says, it is evident that authoritarian governments are a lot better at controlling information. With more advanced news fabrication technologies coming out every day, do you expect that this may be an existential problem for democracies? Do you think some democracies may succumb to authoritarian measures?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. And I do fear that we are on that path. I think there's clearly, we're in an authoritarian resurgence right now. And that's not just because of the rise of China, because of the reassertion of Russian influence outside of its immediate borders. But it's also because in democracies, there have been democracies that have backtracked. And we see this in parts of Europe, certainly. I think we see it.
Turkey and the Philippines and places
Oh
like
yeah,
that.
it's a common theme. And I even would say we've seen some of these concerns just play out in American politics in recent years. I think our institutions in the US certainly held strong, but I mentioned our Hungarian service. which I talked to earlier today, we returned to Hungary last year after leaving the market after in the years that followed 1989. And we returned for a reason. We returned because a democratically elected government, and the Orban government, is consolidating control over the media, is suppressing free speech. And it was our assessment and the assessment of other groups that there was a need for something like an independent, publicly funded international network aimed at the Hungarian audience. And so 5 years ago, I would have never predicted that RFERL would actually be expanding, because ultimately we should be in the business of shutting down our services and saying that these are vibrant democracies where there's freedom of the press.
Yeah. Another interesting question that has arisen, I think, in discussions over the last few weeks comes from a viewer who says, when Twitter suspended President Trump's account following the Capitol riot, it provoked an interesting response from Alexei Navalny, the famous Russian dissident today who recently recovered from an attempted nerve gas poisoning. I think not nerve gas, he means probably Novichok. Navalny worried that the move would be exploited by authoritarian governments who want to quash legitimate dissent on social media. So how do we balance promoting the free and open flow of information with combating misinformation, or even worse, disinformation?
Yeah, that's another important question. And it's something that I've struggled with because I've seen in the markets where RFERL operates, authoritarian regimes try to control all the various avenues of dissent and conversation. We see this right now actually in Russia, which has been targeting Twitter, railing about Western platforms, and actually talking about creating its own alternatives. And so my personal view about the Trump Twitter ban is that I'm not sure I understand why the companies felt that they needed to better police their terms of service, but the companies have not really done this in a consistent manner in a way that gains credibility with a broad swath of the public, because the part of the public that supports Donald Trump felt that it was politically motivated and targeted at him. And the net impact too is that then it drives some of those voices to other platforms, which is not always a great solution either. Some of those platforms often are places where then more extreme content can be shared. And so I actually think that companies need to be very careful about regulating speech. They should certainly be able to influence and to operationalize their terms of service. And so if there are violations of their terms of service, but no one elected Mark Zuckerberg, no one elected Jack Dorsey at Twitter. And so I think when they try to take on these roles of policing what is and is not allowed speech, it actually has significant negative repercussions, not just abroad and authoritarians modeling that approach, but also in US political discourse.
Well, I asked others this question. Does, Mr. Jefferson's famous comment about good ideas driving out bad ideas still hold, 245 years later? Because from economics, we know that bad currency will drive out good currency in an economy. So is this simply a matter of saying, well, we need multiple voices in order to seek the truth? But frequently, some of those voices own very loud and powerful megaphones. And given the increasingly narrow set of choices a lot of people make now, or that are made for them, two questions. One, is Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act going to survive? That's the section that holds the social media platforms harmless for what's posted there. Or is there another approach? In Europe, the EU, I think increasingly in Japan, they're looking at regulating those social media platforms as if they were a utility. And so they would report to a public utility board rather than their own board of directors handpicked. In the US, what I hear is no one has any appetite for regulating speech. So the answer seems to be break them up, the way we did with AT&T or with Standard Oil. So there's the Section 230 issue, and then there's the regulatory issue. Should we break them up? Should we treat them as a public utility?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a personal position on the exact way that the US should deal with the Section 230 issue. It is just, as an observer and someone who has worked a bit in American politics in the past, it's been interesting to watch this debate evolve because there's growing bipartisan frustration about the power of the big tech companies and the social media platforms. I see all the signs of potential significant change. I think some of that and how it manifests itself will depend on what position the Biden administration ultimately takes and how much they endorse change. But it has been interesting to watch when you have someone like Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley on the right saying things that aren't all that different than Elizabeth Warren on the left. It's an interesting phenomenon in American politics.
It is.
And I just don't know where that will all lead. And they're also kind of saying similar things for somewhat different reasons. A little bit on the European approach, because I've followed that closely at the German Marshall Fund and just living in Europe in recent years. I do think the Europeans have made some smart decisions about at least being more open to regulation. I don't think they've gotten they haven't come up with the perfect solution, but I think in the European regulatory debates, there's at least more awareness about how much of a societal vulnerability this status quo is, and they are a bit more advanced. Now, I think ultimately what might be the best approach is if the US and the Europeans, maybe the Australians and others, Canadians got together and kind of pursued some similar approaches, because right now the other problem though that we have is we still have a very kind of nationalistic approach towards the companies, which then bleeds over into broader diplomatic fights between the US and Europe, because the US feels it needs to protect its own companies, given that most of these are based in the US from European regulation. So I'm a big proponent of more transatlantic engagement on this and some sort of coherent transatlantic approach to whatever regulation we decide to pursue.
So let me ask you this: as an Air Force officer stationed overseas, I'm thinking about a tour in Labrador at one time. I have not far from me, right here in my home office, a shortwave radio. Is there a frequency where Americans in the United States could tune in to Radio Free Europe, or is that sort of thing forbidden?
It's I'm not even sure if any of the frequencies reach the US. It's actually a good question, which I'm not sure I know the answer to. We are still broadcasting on radio, as I said, in some languages, usually in pretty remote areas in places like Afghanistan or Pakistan. But people can access our content. We have a website, rferl.org, which is an English language news site. So you can read and interact with our content. People can follow us on all the relevant social media platforms. And we also put out some limited English content. But by law, you're right, because of something called the Smith-Mundt Act, since we are funded through the US Congress, we are not allowed to put together programming or promote our material directly for an American audience. And so, no, we could not produce a program specifically for Americans.
So rferl.org?
Yes.
All right, good. Well, I have a new place to go look for news at this point. Jamie Fly, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We genuinely appreciate both. We wish you well. I look to the days when I can return to Berlin and Prague and walk around as a tourist pretending I'm a local. I miss all of that as much as anything. hoping for better days just ahead. Thank you for all the good work you do, and thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you, and you're welcome to visit anytime our headquarters in Prague. Let me
Good.
know when
Well,
you're in
it's
town.
on my diary. Thank you so much. And to our viewers, thank you for your time. It's a privilege to be with you. We'll see you again in 2 weeks on April 9th when Hani Farid, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, will talk to us about digital forensics, image analysis, and human perception. His topic is trust and truth in the age of deep fakes. Should be interesting. So I wish you well. Care for yourselves, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Goodbye, everyone.